How's it going, everyone? RivalRyyyy here, and welcome back to the channel. No, wait, we're going into 2025, so we need to do a bit of housekeeping for this channel going forward. How's it going, everyone? RivalRyyyy here, and welcome back to the channel. Going forward in 2025, you're unfortunately going to see my face when I make poor Pokemon opinions instead of just dealing with the gameplay. Don't worry, you can still see me run through Pokemon games, but nowadays you're going to see a bit of an interjection of just my face instead of just seeing the gameplay. And to start off 2025, I'm going to tackle a topic that I've put off for quite a while now because I feel like it's such a difficult list to actually make. Today it's time to talk about the DS games for Pokemon and what the best one is to play. As it stands, the Nintendo DS holds the record for the total amount of Pokemon games available on one console and the joint amount of main series games available on one console as well, something that it holds with the Nintendo Switch. It would not a big change for the franchise going forward because previously we would only get one generation per handheld console. This changed with the DS as we would now end up getting 2 generations per console instead. Not just the main series titles, but the sub-series would get a massive change as well, with both the Pokemon Ranger and the Mystery Dungeon series making their debut on the Nintendo DS. Because of the amount of innovation and change on the Nintendo DS for Pokemon, I would honestly go as far as to say that the Nintendo DS was the golden age for Pokemon. This isn't down to just the quantity of games that are available, but also the quality of them as well. The DS is honestly the sweet spot for any Pokemon fan. Bear in mind a total of 3 generations got to star on the Nintendo DS. So, let's get started. What's the best Pokemon game on the Nintendo DS? And to start off at number 15, we have Learning with Pokemon Typing Adventure. This game sits in a very unique category for Pokemon. Not because it's massively innovative or anything, but because most people won't have actually got the chance to play it. It's one of the only games released that got a localization in English, but never got released in America. Now, I could never actually find a reason for why this occurred, and trust me, I looked around the internet quite a bit to try and find an answer. It's very weird because it got released in both England and Australia, so there were 2 countries that spoke English, and it got localized in multiple other languages and used the keyboards that were retrospective to that country. Now, there are rare instances where Pokemon games aren't released in countries but are released in others. One of the ones that sticks out to me is Hey You Pikachu that was released on the Nintendo 64, which did get an American release but didn't get any form of release in Europe. However, for that one, there is a reason behind that. The peripheral that it used was not actually released in the PAL version. It was quite an expensive item that only used 2 games, so I imagine they didn't want to release it in Europe because there was basically no point. There's other variances of this happening, such as the mini Tetris game getting released in Europe but not America as well, but this was a Pokemon education game in the early 2010s, and the fact that it had the effort to have a translation in English but didn't get released in America was a bit odd. It's a bit of a weird part of Pokemon history as most people in America won't have actually got the chance to play this game. Now, it is very simple in nature. It aims to teach the player how to type on the keyboard by entering Pokemon names. You take the role of a rookie typist because we've been Pokemon trainers, explorers, rangers, why not a typer now as well? Honestly, at some point we're going to end up being like builders or something in Pokemon, like we just make up things, honestly. You can capture the Pokemon by typing their name correctly. The game does have advanced stages and courses as well, which makes it not just a typing game but something that you can actually learn and progress with. It's only 15 on this list because, well, it's an educational game. I think it's a simple and nice game. I think it certainly deserves points for combining both Pokemon with educational, but the reality is that's as far as it goes. I certainly think it does its job very well, but I don't feel an educational game can be ranked higher than bottom on this list. Unless, of course, you're coming to Pokemon to learn how to type, in which case I think it's absolutely amazing and should be number 1. It exists for a reason and it certainly does its job very well. If you want to learn how to use a keyboard by typing in Pokemon names, then this is certainly the game for you, but otherwise this is a game you could easily skip in the franchise. Number 14, Pokemon Dash. Oh, how fun I get to talk about this game again. For those who are currently unaware, Pokemon Dash is the lowest rated Pokemon game that you can purchase right now that's not a closable down app, which, truth be told, is a very impressive achievement. For a series that has over 100 games, to be the worst rated Pokemon game available is pretty impressive. The reason Pokemon Dash is seen as so bad is because it's a gimmick game at the end of the day, and it doesn't really go further than just that gimmick alone. Nintendo are very notorious for releasing consoles that have a particular gimmick attached to them. This has worked in their favour over the years as it allows them to distinguish themselves from their competition, as they're offering a different way to play. If you look back at some of the consoles that Nintendo have had in the past, the 3DS used, well, 3D. The Nintendo Switch is both a home console and a handheld console, whilst the Nintendo Wii used motion capture that made it the best-selling home console Nintendo have had until the Switch. Well, for the Nintendo DS, it was all about the dual screens. So when it came time for the release of the Nintendo DS, it was important they had games that showed off the unique capabilities of it. Nintendo have always been in a unique position in the market compared to other video game companies. And that's because the characters that they have on their consoles are exclusively theirs and not featured on other consoles. Now, obviously every video game company has their own unique characters, but none of them are as recognizable as Nintendo. Video game is no longer the early 90s of Mario and Nintendo versus Sega and Sonic. Unlike other video game companies, Nintendo have maintained their IPs to a very good level and therefore own the monopoly when it comes to recognizable characters. One of the best games that's on the Nintendo Switch is the Breath of the Wild. It's now gone on to sell over 34 million copies worldwide. The reality is first impressions are important for a console, so it was important for Nintendo to make a good impression due to their unique position with their characters, and therefore getting a Pokemon game out for launch was a good idea. And what resulted from this was Pokemon Dash, the worst rated Pokemon game you can buy right now. The game involves taking advantage of the new technology using the touchscreens in order to move Pikachu around the screen through checkpoints in order to win races. And that's it. That's all the game is. There's not much more to it other than that. Now, of course, there is a few variations in gameplay, including flying on balloons, or having to go through different terrains, but the game's main core is trying to show off the dual screens of the Nintendo DS. Because it doesn't offer much variety, it's rated pretty terribly for the most part, except for joke reviews that say it's the best thing since sliced bread. The only reason this isn't 15th on this list is because learning with Pokemon is an educational game, and I think it's important to separate what a standard game is from something that's trying to teach you something. It's a gimmick at the end of the day, and it's trying to show off the new technology that they've created, which I understand. The reality is there's been games that were released on a Nintendo DS that are Pokemon related that definitely show off the dual screens better. There's not much involved in it other than that, and therefore it's finding itself at 14th on this list. Number 13, Pokemon Trozei. For those of you as old as myself, you'll definitely remember Pokemon Puzzle Challenge on the Game Boy Color, or Pokemon Puzzle League on the Nintendo 64. Creating puzzle games is a pretty simple concept. There's a few different ways you can create a puzzle game for a franchise nowadays. One option is to take an already existing style of puzzle and then put a Pokemon overlay over it, like how Pokemon Puzzle League is patterned upon from Super Nintendo but includes Pokemon characters from the anime such as Gary and Team Rocket. Or if you're not a fan of putting a Pokemon overlay in a previous game, you can take already existing puzzle games and then meld them together to make a new style. Trozei takes elements from Yoshi's Cookie and Tetris in order to make a new style game for Pokemon, and features a massive battle with the Phobos Battalion. As puzzle games go, it's actually pretty enjoyable and an easy one to pick up and understand. You have tutorials that show you how to make combinations and progress through the game. Truth be told, I actually feel really bad about putting Trozei so far down on this list. It's actually a good enough puzzle game that's worth checking out. Putting it at 13th makes it feel like this game is absolutely terrible, but that's certainly not the case. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I found it really difficult to rank these games because a lot of them are really good. And being put 13th on a list that only has 15 implies it's one of the worst games available, but it's simply not the case. The reality is the Nintendo DS is comfortably the best era of Pokemon, and therefore some games suffer on this list because of it. The only reason Trozei is so far down on this list is because not only is it a puzzle game and therefore lacks a lot of innovation going forward, and the fact that the game is severely short in length. You can complete this game in relatively no time at all compared to some other games on this list, and at the end of the day, a puzzle game is a puzzle game. I don't know if it's just me, but I can easily get bored with playing a puzzle game. Unless you learn how to speedrun the game, in which case I guarantee it's probably a lot of fun. Don't take being number 13 on this list as meaning that Trozei isn't a game worth playing. It certainly is. It's just a victim of the fact that the Nintendo DS is easily Pokemon's best era. It's a good game and it certainly fits in with the other positively reviewed Pokemon puzzle games. Now number 12, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team. I wholeheartedly blame Red and Blue Rescue Team for the fact that I wanted to get a psychology degree when I was older. I needed to explain to me why I wasn't late for meetings that meant I was a Hardy type and therefore a Charmander when I magically transformed into a Pokemon. Okay, maybe not that deep, but I did find it interesting the type of questions you were asked at the start of Mystery Dungeon. The series focused on the idea of a human being being transformed into a Pokemon, gaining the ability to speak to Pokemon with no issue, as they form a rescue team whilst trying to understand how they became a Pokemon in the first place. Red and Blue Rescue Team were released for both the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS, something that unfortunately makes Blue Rescue Team suffer because they were developed simultaneously with each other, and Blue Rescue Team does not feature any graphical enhancements or developments from Red Rescue Team. Team, despite being on a stronger platform, with the only difference being the use of the 2 screens for Blue Rescue Team to try and capitalise on the gimmick of the Nintendo DS. Now without a doubt, the star of the Blue Rescue Team game is Gengar. The story surrounding its origins and the development of the character whilst you go through your own trial and tribulations gives layers to a story beyond just your own party. A game with a lot of spin-off games, it takes the idea that already exists with Mystery Dungeon, then brings it over and makes it a game surrounding Pokemon. I'm not gonna lie to everybody, putting Blue Rescue Team this low down on the list really hurts my soul, because Red Rescue Team is actually my favourite Pokemon game ever made. But objectively, there are better Mystery Dungeon games on this console alone, and they improve on those games while having a better story. And that certainly hurts this game that there's other things in this series that are much better. It's a shame it's this far down on the list. Again, it's a great game and definitely deserves its plaudits for what it's brought to the series, but it's lower down because of the games that follow it that take the formula and make it better. Now moving on to 11, 10 and 9 on this list: Pokemon Ranger Guardian Signs, and Pokemon Ranger Shadows of Almia. So you may feel like it's a bit of a cop-out answer to put all of these games at the same point on this list. And yes, it is a cop-out. I'm going to fully admit that. Truth be told, I really struggled to split the 3 games from each other because there are minor changes in the 2 sequels for Ranger, but I'm not entirely sure the changes are big enough to warrant them automatically being considered better than the previous ones. I have a major issue with the Ranger series, and it's not because it's bad. The reality is I thought it was quite an innovative and different way to play Pokemon at the time, but at the same time that innovative way is completely reliant on the dual screen nature of the Nintendo DS, which makes it very difficult to see any future for the spin-off series. The fact that it got 2 sequels is a testament to how popular Pokemon Ranger was at the time, which is much more than some other spin-off series have ever got, but the gameplay was so heavily reliant on the Nintendo DS stylus pen, which was great for the time, but not only was it very difficult to transfer over that Game Boy to another console because they don't have 2 screens anymore, and to be honest, why would you want to anyways? This game was a complete screen destroyer. And not just that, but you were using an easily losable peripheral that sure could be replaceable for a few pounds, but it definitely caused a bit of an inconvenience for you. The core mechanics of what make Pokemon Ranger a fun game are exclusive to only the DS and 3DS, and I have no idea how you're going to transfer that in a future Ranger game. It certainly uses the dual screens with the DS very well. In fact, it's so significantly better than Pokemon Dash's use of it that I would argue if Pokemon Ranger was a launch title for the Nintendo DS, there would be absolutely no point in Pokemon Dash existing as a game. I would argue they're the best use of the dual screen for the series, but at the same time, because it uses those screens so well, I don't see how you're going to transfer that to a future console. The gameplay involves you trying to catch a Pokemon with a stylus pen by circling around them while avoiding them breaking the cycle. I think it's fun and enjoyable, but how are you going to transfer that over to something like the Nintendo Switch? See, it's very easy to transfer over the mechanics of the main series games to the Nintendo DS, but I just don't see how you're going to do that for the Pokemon Ranger series, unfortunately. Now, Shadows of Almia and Guardian Signs did improve on elements of Pokemon Ranger, including the gameplay allowing you to swap out partner Pokemon, or adding rideable Pokemon as well. But the main reason I'm putting all 3 of them at the same point on this list is because I feel that you can play any of them and get the actual experience of Pokemon Ranger without missing out on too much by doing so. For argument's sake, if I was going to rank it based on story, I would definitely give Shadows of Almia the edge with Guardian Signs just below it and Ranger last. So let's rank that as 11, 10 and 9. I'm quite a sucker for Darkrai at the end of the day, so if the gameplay includes it, I'm definitely going to like it. But I feel like you can play any of these 3 games and understand what Pokemon Ranger is and not miss out on an experience. It was innovative and different compared to other Pokemon games, and the original gave you the opportunity to get yourself a Manaphy as well. But overall, I feel like you can pick up any of the Pokemon Ranger games and get the experience you need without missing on too much. Number 8, Explorers of Time and Space. So I'm just going to pause for a second so you can see this face that's currently on the screen. It's a face that acknowledges that he's got a problem, but doesn't immediately deal with it. So I noticed the battery was dying on my camera, but because I was in a rhythm, I decided to keep going. It only just appeared, so I thought there'd be no issues. I should be able to get a bit more out of this. I didn't. I must have been talking to a dead camera for a solid 20 minutes, which is great of me and a complete waste of time. You can tell I'm not used to this. So I'm going to pick up the rest of this list how we used to do, with just some terrible gameplay instead. So number 8 on this list is Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time and Darkness, not space. Now, let me tell you something that was so simplistic but dragged all of us young Pokemons back for a new game: the concept of a new form for an existing Pokemon. It happened with Shadow Lugia in XD Gale of Darkness, and the same is true for Primal Dialga in these games. I mean, look at it. It's just a simple design change, but it just just looked so cool. Pokemon was pretty simple back in the day and we were very easily pleased. So giving us a Pokemon we already knew with a new form, and all of a sudden we're 100% interested. Now Explorers of Time and Darkness do exactly what I mentioned previously with Blue Rescue Team. They take the mystery dungeon formula that was already working and make it even better. The story is better and evidently a bit more darker at points, which makes it quite an intriguing play looking at the dynamics between the criminal Grovyle and the famous explorer Dustoir, and it achieves a major goal of adding layers to some Pokemon. And that's definitely one of the main reasons why Mystery Dungeon as a series is so loved amongst Pokemon fans. The battle is a lot of fun, but other than a dex entry or the legendaries if they're involved in the main crux of the story, we rarely get to see the personalities of some Pokemon in the games. And it's not just Eevee nodding its head in Let's Go Eevee, or a dex entry that paints Drowsy and Hypno as some of the creepiest Pokemon in existence. That being said, Drowsy is a villain in this game, so it might actually be accurate. The Pokemon get a legitimate focus beyond just battling in Mystery Dungeon. You get to see Pokemon in a different light, and if you're a fan of Pokemon in general, seeing everyday life of a Pokemon is a fun thing to explore. Mystery Dungeon might be the best look we get into one particular world in Pokemon. Now I've done a lot of praising here, so you're probably wondering why it's only 8th on this list. Now it's mostly down to another game that's on this list later on. Fact of the matter is it's not the definitive way to play Mystery Dungeon on the Nintendo DS, and therefore it's important to know other games higher. Now, financially, it might be a better option than the other game on this list, but that shouldn't devalue the story and integral ideas that Explorers of Time and Darkness provide to the series. Number 7, Pokemon Conquest. There's something just fascinating to gaming fans about crossover gameplay between series that results in all kinds of wacky and wonderful ideas. Now, Pokemon has its own style of role-playing game that is very popular in itself. Pokemon's battling falls into the turn-based RPG system. It's probably the most popular style that's existed for RPGs since the rise of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest in the 80s and 90s. But another popular style that blends turn-based battling with a tactical style idea, hence the name Tactical RPG, is a method that Pokemon hadn't explored until Pokemon Conquest. I said a game we mostly attribute to this style nowadays is Fire Emblem, but it's been an ever-present game in Japan. So naturally, because we crave to see something different with Pokemon, we got ourselves our own tactical RPG in Pokemon Conquest, which I've got to say is actually really good. It's actually a crossover with another series, Nomagana's Ambition, which is a series that's a bit hit and miss in terms of a release in the West. It means it's probably something you won't be aware of without going out of your way to find a tactical RPG. I think Pokemon can be fairly criticised for not taking too many chances sometimes with its game and ideas. It's a brand that's very successful and rightfully so naturally you want to play it safe, especially if something ends up going wrong. But this is a moment where they deserve a lot of praise for their decision to take a chance on a game style they hadn't done previously for Pokemon, and for giving the development to a different team in order to do so. Granted, it's a proven company that handled the development of this game, which is very important, but still they took the chance, and that deserves to be commended. IGN actually ranked this game as the 12th best game on the Nintendo DS. Bear in mind this is higher than games such as Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney and Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks, two very highly acclaimed and loved games, with Ace Attorney in particular having a DS release in the West that caused stores to struggle with stock because of its explosion in popularity. Again, like a few things on this list, we're talking so positively about Pokemon Conquest, but it's only at 7th on this list. Well, this is mostly down to main series tax, unfortunately. It only suffers on this list down to the fact that there's so many main series titles available on the Nintendo DS. Only one spin-off game is above it, and that's a good game as well. You shouldn't underestimate it because of its placement here either. Once again, this is another game that's very expensive to purchase. We have on many occasions talked about why the Pokemon games are so expensive and how absolutely outrageous it is. Now, unlike some other games, this is definitely down to the total amount of games currently available, as the pool of games available that are in good condition is definitely lower, so it's definitely important to bear that in mind. But still, it's a great game and the 7th best game on a Nintendo DS for Pokemon. Number 6, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Naturally, the top end of a best Pokemon game list is going to be dominated by main series titles, because they always contain the most effort and planning behind them. It is important to note, however, there is one spin-off game that's managed to get itself above one of the main series titles. And that's not a knock on Diamond and Pearl per se as a bad game. There's just significantly better options above it, and that's why it's fallen down a bit on this list. The first Generation 4 entries brought us a fun story and region to explore, with some very key changes to the series. The the most important thing being the physical and special split, with Pokemon moves no longer being tied down to typings. Weirdly enough, the first 3 generations, despite moves implying physical attacking, actually wasn't the case because every typing had its own designated attack stat to use. Best way to remember it, if it had an evolution, and this includes the ones introduced in Generation 2 and 4, or was a Dragon type, it was a special based attack. Everything else was physical. It was a very odd mechanic, to be honest. Pokemon like Hitmonchan could have a great move pool of Fire Punch, Thunder Punch, Ice Punch, and a fighting type move, which would give it not only same type attack bonus, but great coverage for your team, only for it to be completely destroyed because it's using its special based attack for those first 3 moves. Bear in mind, Hitmonchan had a special based attack of 35, while its physical attack was 105. The only real mention we ever had of this was some help in Fire Red and Leaf Green, so previously players would be running around with a Gyarados in Generation 2, with Dragon Breath, Waterfall, Icy Wind and Zap Cannon, but having no idea only half of its actual potential is being used. Granted, only one of them is now physical, but there was no indication of which move was using the Pokemon's full potential, because there's a massive difference between a 60 base special attack and a 125 based attack. Never really made sense, and I've never been able to find an explanation for why it was like that, because it wasn't just Hitmonchan that were affected, but Pokemon like Sneasel as well. When you combine this split with some different moves, including physical based psychic moves and special based fighting moves, it meant Generation 4 solved the big problem that had existed within the series since the beginning. The problems with Diamond and Pearl, however, are very evident. First things first, there are a total of 2 accessible, fully evolved fire types in the entire game, with one of them being the starter, so if you didn't choose it, you would have to get a Rapidash. Granted, there weren't too many fire types actually introduced in Generation 4, one of them is a legendary, but they did introduce a new evolution to a previous Pokemon in this generation, which brings forth another major issue: new Pokemon not being accessible in the main playthrough until after completion. There are a multitude of Pokemon introduced in Generation 4 that are evolutions of previous Pokemon that almost give life to a previous generation. And how many of them are available in a general Diamond and Pearl playthrough? Just 4. There's so many evolutions included and you can only access 4 of them. One of these Pokemon was accessible by the Honey Trees, which was a very infuriating thing to do. This leads to a lot of unbalanced and odd teams throughout the game. 2 gym leaders don't even have full teams of their particular types because there isn't enough electric or ice types available, due to some of them being locked behind the post-game content despite being a Gen 4 evolution. Probably the most ridiculous one is having a fire type Elite Four despite only having 2 fully evolved fire types available. It was a very odd design choice that definitely hinders the structure and validity of some of the teams you face. They clearly realised their mistake for the 3rd game and corrected these problems, but it made even less sense when you considered their usual anime advertisement was used on a Pokemon that's not actually available in Diamond and Pearl initially. For those who have never really followed the anime in the past, they had quite a habit of featuring a new Pokemon in the anime in preparation for the future games. I mean, all the way back in episode 1 where Ho-Oh is shown. This is long before it's featured in Pokemon Gold. In the episode Home is where the start is, Ash faces off against Gary for the first time since Johto and Gary's got an Electivire, a new Pokemon we'd never seen before. This had aired in Japan 2 weeks before the release of Diamond and Pearl, and 1 month before its release in the US. Like with previous installments such as Blaziken and Johto, it gets you excited for the possibility of using Pokemon for a playthrough, but nope, Electivire falls in that you can't get it until post-game category in Diamond and Pearl. Oh, and this is just a minor annoyance, but what is with those health bars in Generation 4? We've all seen the Blissey drop into 0 memes that float around on the internet, but seriously, why is it that slow? Even with these strange design choices, the games themselves are great entries to the series. They just needed some polishing in terms of Pokemon availability as it seriously affects the game, with these issues being strictly down to design choice. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl can slot in at number 6. Number 5, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of the Sky. Now it's time to discuss a key battle when deciding what the best of any game series is. And that is the concept of a review by a professional company and the fan reception of said game. Explorers of the Sky is one of the worst rated Pokemon games on this entire list. Most reviews of Explorers of the Sky slam the game for a multitude of reasons, including a lack of innovation, especially when you compare it to Explorers of Time and Darkness, because this game acts as a 3rd game similar to the main series titles, with Explorers of the Sky essentially acting as a definitive edition of those games when it was released. Fan reception of this game, however, has always been significantly higher than any of the reviews give it credit for. So the reviews are very low, yet the fan reception is very high. You're probably thinking one of 2 things. Either the reviews have done a bad job at reviewing the game, or Pokemon fans are liking a bad game. Well, I'm here to tell you that both reviews and the fan reception are both correct. The reviews are there to focus on the games themselves and how they stand up within the sub-series of them. With every game, you're expecting innovation and change within the franchise in order to keep it fresh. As an example, for the main series games from Generation 1 to Generation 4, there were with significant developments in gameplay mechanics that changed the core gameplay just based on standard functionality alone. From Generation 1 to Generation 2, this wasn't just bug fixes, but included things like splitting the special stat into special attack and special defense. From Generations 2 to 3, it was the introduction of abilities that forever changed how we play the game. From Generation 3 to Generation 4, it was the physical special split of moves, which no longer meant a particular type was only using the special attack or the attack stat, which finally unlocked the potential of some Pokemon who were no longer hurt by the fact they could use all the elemental punches, but the elemental punches used its very poor special attack. The biggest development in terms of functionality after that was the introduction of fairy types in Generation 6 in order to balance out dragon types, but beyond that the major changes for the franchise haven't been anything to do with standard functionality, but instead giving you a different way to play. Mega Evolution is a functionality for Generation 6 that's also featured in Generation 7, and it's a different way to play. Just like Gigantamaxing is and so on and so forth. There comes a point where the core development of the gameplay can't improve too much anymore, so instead to keep it fresh you have to introduce different ways to play in order to keep it thriving. And that's why we've had generational gimmicks that are only used in one generation, minus Mega Evolution because it was so popular. And that's the major problem that the Mystery Dungeon series has and why reviewers always rate it so low. They have to look at it from a neutral view, and from that perspective there's not many changes or differences because you can't really change the dungeon formula too much. It's a tried and tested method that's existed for years, so it's hard to maneuver too much around that. So from an outsider's perspective as a reviewer, Explorers of the Sky doesn't really change too much in terms of core gameplay that would warrant a massive score. In fact, none of the Mystery Dungeon series really do that, because while some minor changes exist across the installments, they are usually minute. Another major problem that it has is that it's sometimes compared to the main series titles, which puts a lot of unfair expectation on it. On the other hand, fans love Time and Darkness, and Explorers of the Sky is basically the definitive version of them. It includes missing 4th gen Pokemon, character developments and subplots, and some minor general quality of life improvements. And that's why it's 5th on this list. It's the game ranked 8th but better. It's important to not just look at what a review says or what the fans say, but instead use them both in tandem with each other to draw a conclusion. Neither the reviews or fan reception alone can give you a definitive answer. For an example, I watched the Red One film recently that stars the leader of the Bloodline, The Rock. Now the reviews of this movie absolutely slate it. I think it's got about 30% on Rotten Tomatoes. So overall you'd think this is a bad movie based on reviews alone. But the fan reception was much higher, so it doesn't really give you a definitive picture. Reviews say bad, but fans say good. So I watched it and I quite enjoyed it actually. It wasn't a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, but it was silly and fun, which you can't complain about when you get a Christmas movie that stars an 8-time WWE champion that plays a 300-year-old Alpha Santa. Reviewers are paid to do a job while you're going to pay for the game to enjoy it, so both in tandem is important. Explorers of the Sky is going in at number 5 on this list, which is the highest ranking for any game on this list that's classed as sub-series. Now is it worth the price some retailers are trying to charge for the pre-owned version of it? Well, that's another question entirely. Okay, so it's time for the top 4 now. And I'm not going to lie to you, this top 4 is one of the most difficult rankings you can do for Pokemon games in general. Any of these top 4 could easily be the best Pokemon game on the Nintendo DS and not look out of place. And that's not me trying to cop out here, by the way, and give myself an excuse when somebody says, but RivalRyyyy, you put this game at 3, but it should be 1. You don't know what you're talking about. You should no longer make videos based on Pokemon. Also, your accent is weird. That accent jab is actually something I've had before. Is the Mancunian one really that out of place? I think every other system that includes Pokemon games has had a pretty definitive answer on what's the best game on that console, and I'm about to spoil some of my previous videos, so make sure to go check them out before you hear this point. But I do think the best game on the Switch so far is Legends Arceus, and the best game on the Game Boy Advance is Emerald. But for the Nintendo DS, it's so much closer in terms of discussion, because it's legitimately the best era of Pokemon, at least in my opinion, that we've had. Deciding the top 4 feels like splitting hairs more than any other Pokemon ranking video, because it really does have something for everybody, and I guarantee someone's going to be offended by what I pick here, so it can't be helped either way. But let's dive into it. Let's rank the final 4 entries of the Nintendo DS. Number 4, Pokemon Platinum. I really don't think there's ever been a bigger gap between the original game releases and a third game in Pokemon than Pokemon Diamond and Pearl to Pokemon Platinum. It's almost outrageous how important the differences are to the quality of life and playability of Generation 4. Nearly every problem I mentioned with Diamond and Pearl is fixed Platinum. We can use Pokemon that are actually in Generation 4 now. Teams have actual typings that match them instead of just putting an Octillery and an Ambipom on an electric type gym leader. Granted, this was a pretty simple solution. The problems were painfully obvious on the first playthrough of Diamond and Pearl, because 2 gym leaders and an Elite 4 member didn't have a proper full team. I'd say 1 could be excusable, but multiple. It simply didn't make any sense when Pokemon introduced that generation that should have been available to them. Where Platinum shines, however, is beyond just the changes that were needed from Diamond Diamond and Pearl, but the additional story and content that was provided. The introduction of Giratina on the Sky Pillar is still to this day one of the best scenes in any Pokemon game ever made. The Shadow-like Pokemon makes an appearance solely to stop the evil team's plan by dragging its leader to the distorted world. The origin of the Shadow Pokemon was how violent it was, yet it came to protect the world when it needed it the most. Naturally, because it was so popular in Generation 3, the Battle Frontier is brought back in Platinum, allowing players to once again build teams in a frustrating fashion in order to collect all those emblems. Platinum is still the most definitive way to play Generation 4 right now, and quite comfortably might I add as well, which is quite impressive considering Generation 4 has a remake. If you look back at all the other remakes, you can argue 1 to 3 are the definitive additions to play their retrospective generations, but Platinum is still the best way to play Generation 4 by a mile. The changes and inclusions in Platinum definitely hurt Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, simply because the games didn't include many of the changes that Platinum had provided. Now sure, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire didn't have the Battle Frontier, but it did have the Delta episode, which is a satisfying inclusion in place of having the ability to go through it. There's no inclusion similar in equivalence to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, which definitely frustrated a lot of people. Oh, and the art style, people definitely didn't like that either, but I was never really fazed by it. And that's a testament to how good Platinum is. And because of that, it's very, very difficult to place this only 4th in this list. It's a testament to how good Pokemon games were for the DS. They're one of the best games we have, and arguably one of the best games that are classed as 3rd in a generation, is only sitting at 4th on this list. Number 3, Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Okay, this is where the pitchforks come out, I think. I know that people are not going to be happy that I've put in this place, but let me explain something. I have a massive affinity towards Generation 2 because Gold and Silver is how I got into the franchise. They are fantastic games, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver are fantastic games in themselves as well. But a lot of the things that make Heart Gold and Soul Silver better are simply the changes that Pokemon have provided throughout the series that I had missed out on in Generation 3 and 4. We get to go through 16 gyms and battle Red at the end. They fix some of the issues that I've always felt existed from Gold and Silver, including the weird leveling system they had for the gym leaders in Kanto. I'm sure many would agree that these are definitely the best remake games we've ever had, because honestly it's just so much fun. Separating bias is difficult when it comes to doing a list like this. In terms of favourite Pokemon games on the DS, Heart Gold and Soul Silver are definitely my favourite entries we got. Again, we're really splitting hairs at this point with the top 4, and I completely understand arguing for Heart Gold and Soul Silver to top. But the only reason that I'm placing it 3rd in this list is because it was a remake of a game that was already great. And the things that Heart Gold and Soul Silver improve about from the original are more to do with how Pokemon has changed between generations 2 to 4, and not to do with how Heart Gold and Soul Silver were innovating gameplay or providing an amazing story. I understand feeling that reasoning's a little bit unfair, but we really are splitting hairs at this point to decide what the best Pokemon game is on the DS. And the reality is, for me, it was a remake of an already great game, so of course you know it's going to be great when it has a remake. And the changes that are provided to Heart Gold and Soul Silver are more to do with how the series had developed as a whole, and making Generation 2 fit into that criteria. Amazing game, probably the best remake we ever had, and if we could get a future release that would be great, because Generation 2 has been banished to the Shadow Realm for 15 years, and it's going in at number 3 on this list. Number 2, Pokemon Black and White. I'm going to try and keep it simple here. It's the story. The story is the reason that Black and White is number 2 on this list, and above all Heart Gold and Soul Silver and Platinum. One of the major issues I've always had in Pokemon is that the evil team's ambitions never make any sense. Most evil teams in Pokemon just want to take over the world or have unrealistic sort of goals such as expanding the landmass, which would be catastrophic to human life and destroy everything. Or they want to remake the universe, just pick your choice. Team Plasma's goal, however, was something very different. In particular, the game is more about the ideals behind having Pokemon in Pokeballs. There is a massive clash of ideals with ends focused on the freedom of Pokemon, clashing with the ideal of the literal game itself, because you're keeping Pokemon in Pokeballs. I mean, the Avengers manga even had a Pokemon from a key character defect to End's side, which was pretty cool. Now, Getsis being the true mastermind of Team Plasma does still fill that role of just wanting to take over the world.
Of course!
But they feel like a legitimate threat in the game compared to any of the previous. For the first time, you don't even face the champion at the end of the game. You face N, who's beating the champion, and has a team that contains the opposite box legendary to the game you have. It ups the stakes so much more, making you feel like you're battling for the beliefs of the core of what the game is versus N's. But do you see the point that N has as well? And therefore, you're defending ideals you don't actually believe in yourself. It was so ambitious as a storyline for Pokemon compared to anything they'd done previously. It shows what the Pokemon world is capable of doing in terms of telling a story while still staying in the age range that they aim for. It's a story you can progress with as a kid, but understand the nuances and design as an adult as well. NPCs throughout the game actually comment on plasma, making the whole world feel involved, with people trying to decide for themselves whether the message that they're saying is actually correct or not. Sure, it's a false narrative because Getsis is doing the standard I want to take over the world shtick.
Of course!
But the argument for N's belief makes NPC characters in the game and yourself genuine think, probably more than any other Pokemon game has done previously. Now the major issue with this game was the fact that people weren't happy that you could only use Generation 5 Pokemon throughout, so you weren't able to use your favourite Crobat or Pikachu in a playthrough, but for me I think that's a positive for the game as well. The Pokemon get a starring role in this game because you can't use any previous ones. It's not like they added only 30 Pokemon to this game, it's actually the most that's ever been added in one go, even more than Generation 1. Is this a precursor to their decision to eventually kick out all the Pokemon being available for one game in the future? Maybe. Both the anime and the games for Generation 5 were seen as soft reboots. Hence Pikachu got beat by a new Sniper, which by the way I will not accept any reasoning for that decision because it's still ridiculous to this day. But whether it was a precursor to the future for the series or not, the story is complex enough to actively engage the older fans of the series, while also fitting the target audience rating as well. It's probably the closest we're ever going to come to engaging both sides of the coin Pokemon, which I think is often struggled with because it's such a big series that has gone on for so long now. Pokemon Black and White are fitting in at number 2 on this list. And finally, number 1, Pokemon Black and White 2. How do you top the game that has the best Pokemon story ever made? You make a sequel to it. Black and White 2 feels like the epilogue to everything we needed from Black and White. Very rarely have we ever got a direct sequel to a game in Pokemon, or one that clearly states it as such. Generation 2 happens after Generation 1, hence Red is the final boss, and Cinnabar Island no longer exists due to the eruption of the volcano. But when the time came to make a third game for Generation 5, despite the rumblings of a Pokemon Grey version, instead we got 2 games, Pokemon Black and White 2. Set 2 years after the events of Black and White, you start off in a new town with significant changes to the region. New gym leaders including a former rival of yours for Gym 1, new gym puzzles, a new story that's an expansion on the original games, and a multitude of other changes and additions that add layers to the game. You see an aftermath of a world affected by Team Plasma's original goal. Multiple NPCs comment on the situation from the previous game. The decisions and story of that game feel important, probably more important than any other game. On top of continuing the story from Black and White, we get multiple different inclusions and changes that make the game so fun. Challenge mode is a feature that should be in more Pokemon games. After completing the main story, you unlock Easy mode in White 2 and Challenge mode in Black 2. Easy mode lowers the level of Pokemon, though their stats are still calculated by the normal mode's levels. And Challenge mode not only increases levels but improves the AI as well, while increasing the difficulty of major battle teams with an additional Pokemon. It's a legitimate addition of a challenge without using fan-made rules such as Nuzlocke. The 2 games feel like they're a pair, and that's why in the end I've decided to put them at rank 2 and 1. They're a continuation and a full story in Pokemon that we've probably never had before. You play one for the story that's probably the best in the series, then play its sequel that shows the aftermath, and feels like it's almost like an epilogue of the original game, whilst improving on the flaws from Black and White, as well as adding additional content such as the Pokemon World Tournament, where you can face gym leaders and trainers from all previous regions, including once again battling Red. They even removed the restriction of only using Generation 5 Pokemon. The combination of Generation 5 games were the right way to end the series on the Nintendo DS, with incredible story, a focus on the Pokemon, and greatest hit battles along the way. For me, Pokemon Black and White 2 are definitely the best Pokemon games ever made on the DS. Thanks for watching everyone. So I'd actually recorded this full thing without realising that it actually cut out halfway through. I wish I could see the footage of me talking into a camera for about 20 minutes without realising that it wasn't actually recording. It's actually quite impressive. It's going to be a few teething problems for me as I get used to doing this, including the lighting, by the way. I didn't realise it was so bad here, so I'm going to have to change that in the future videos. Now, when doing this list, it actually changed quite a few times, especially the final 4 games, because I feel like every single one has their own merit. Honestly, the Nintendo DS had a bit of everything as a fan. Make sure to comment down below if you think my list is correct. Make sure to like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel, and follow me on Twitter for more Pokemon opinions. Going forward, this is going to be a big change to my videos for this channel in 2025. You're going to have to bear with me as I get used to this setup. If you want to check out any of the lists I've done so far and what the best Pokemon game is for that particular console, make sure to check the link in the outro. See you next time, guys.